First Peter is what we want to start working on this morning. Somebody made a request a while back that we do some practical Christianity studying. So we just finished our study on James, and James and 1 Peter are paired together in a way, in that they both work on a lot of really practical stuff. Not a whole lot of deep theology like you get in Paul's letters, but they work on how do you be a Christian? How do you act like a Christian, especially when stuff is hard, when life is hard? So we finished James. We're going to look at 1 Peter. We're probably not going to do 2 Peter because 2 Peter is not so much looking at practical Christianity. It looks into the future, the end of the world, that sort of thing. Not so much practical Christianity. So we're just going to stick with 1 Peter. Okay. So I want to spend a little bit of time introducing you to what it's about, who wrote it, when it was written, who it was written to, that sort of thing. And the first thing we find out in verse 1 is that the writer of the letter identifies himself as Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So, he identifies himself as Peter the apostle. With James, we had like 4 or 5 different James that we had to go through that we know from the Bible. And we had to sort through them and try to figure out which one probably wrote James. Peter, well, we've only got one candidate. We've got Peter the Apostle. Peter of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. There is some question, did that Peter write this book? You would think that, well, he says he wrote it, so why would there be any question? But there is some question. First of all, because scholars like to question. So it's too easy to say, well, Peter wrote it because it says Peter wrote it, and go on to the next one. So they want to dig into this and sort of figure out if there's any other answer. And there are some reasons to wonder if Peter wrote this. What do we know about Peter the man from the Gospels? Well, we know that he was a fisherman. We know he was from Galilee. What's that?
Too loud downstairs.
Too loud downstairs?
Nursery,
Yeah.
like an intercom stereo.
Yeah, unfortunately that old speaker is either on or off.
Blowing your kids' eardrums out.
How's the volume up here? Too loud? Too soft?
That's
Perfect?
fine.
Perfect.
So Peter in the Gospels. First of all, he's a fisherman. He's a Galilean. He is, well, what nice things can we say about Peter in the Gospels? He's the first, one of the very first ones that Jesus calls. But as we go through the rest of the Gospels, we see that Peter likes to speak before he thinks. Lots of occasions where he says something that gets him into trouble with Jesus or with the various people. He tends to jump to conclusions. He tends to spout off. One time he even was talking to Jesus, and Jesus was telling his disciples about how he's going to be crucified and everything. And Peter says, "That's not going to happen to you." And Jesus' response was, "Get behind me, Satan." So Jesus had to rebuke Peter very strongly sometimes. Being a fisherman is not a job that requires a lot of formal education, obviously. Being from Galilee, well, to be honest, for those people back then, being from Galilee is a lot like us saying, well, somebody's from Arkansas or West Virginia. Yes, there are educated people in both of those states, but neither of them are known for producing lots of really educated people, unlike other places. So for Galilee, it was known as kind of a backwater place, a place that didn't have a lot of culture compared to like Jerusalem. In other words, you wouldn't expect somebody from Galilee to be able to write really well, to be able to know, formal logic, that sort of thing. But as you read through 1 Peter, you find that it's really well organized. The Greek is very good Greek. It's written by somebody who appears to know something about formal logic and formal arguments, as the Greeks did it. In other words, for us, we would say, point 1, 2, 3, and then you add them all up and you come to your conclusion. The Greeks would do something similar. Not something that you would think a fisherman from Galilee would know how to do. Steve?
Is it divinely inspired?
Is it divinely inspired? Yes. Since it's in the Bible, since Christians for hundreds of years looked at all the other ones that could have been in there and concluded that 1 Peter was inspired, yes, we can take it that it was. But I'll get to that point too. So in other words, there are some reasons to question. Well, could Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, have written this? And the answer is, well, yes, he could have. There is good Greek in here. It's not the Greek that a native Greek speaker would have written. It's all properly done, but you can tell. I can't tell because I don't read Greek, but I'm told by scholars who do that you can read through this Greek and compare it to the Greek that somebody that's a native Greek speaker would have written, and it's just a little bit not quite as good as a native. So that would suggest that somebody like a Jew. This is the way a Jew would have written it. And the fact is, I was talking about formal rhetoric, where there are rules of how you argue things, and Peter seems to be following a lot of those, but you don't necessarily have to have formal logic training to do that. These rules are really just common sense rules about logical arguing. So that doesn't necessarily mean that Peter couldn't have written it. It's also perfectly possible that Peter could have written it, and then somebody else could have edited it for him, maybe smoothed out some of the language or something like that. So in other words, it does seem like it's written better than Peter would have written it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Peter didn't write it.
My preface in my Bible says that they suspect it was Silas may have aided him in writing it.
So your preface says that Silas may have helped Peter out. Yeah, certainly possible. We know that Silas was associated with Peter, and Silas was a native Greek speaker. Another question about Peter's authorship has to do with the time period that Peter is written in. He makes reference to suffering, to persecution, to various kinds of trials, and it seems, when you compare what we know about Peter and when he died and so forth, that there wasn't a whole lot of persecution going on during Peter's time. So it seems like, well, this would have been written later, when there was actual persecution going on. But again, that doesn't really seem to hold true as a objection that we have to pay strong attention to. There's not a lot of persecution going on in 1 Peter. He talks about a little bit of suffering. He talks about not suffering so much as people getting killed, or at least he doesn't say that, but suffering is in suffering for your faith. Maybe some ostracism from people around you, people not wanting to associate with you because you're weird and you're a Christian. Not so much full-out persecution, which is consistent with an early date. Peter was executed by the Romans probably somewhere around 64 AD. That's probably when Peter died. The scholars are pretty unanimous that that's about when he died. Jesus was crucified, just for some context. Jesus was crucified in 33 AD. So that would be 31 years later. Incidentally, Paul was also executed about the same time. So Peter and Paul died within a couple of years of each other. As far as persecution goes, there's 3 big periods of persecution. Sometimes we think that the Christians were from the point that Jesus died up to when Constantine became emperor, that there was just this constant persecution all over the empire, and that's not actually true. There's 3 emperors, Nero, Domitian, and one more that I'm forgetting, who actually had a policy of persecuting Christians. That they told the whole empire, all their governors, all their lawmakers, everybody, you need to go out and persecute the Christians. If you find them, you need to feed them to the lions and so forth. But only 3 of them. And they didn't have that policy for their entire reign. So there's 3 periods of persecution. In between those periods, Christianity was everything from tolerated to don't ask, don't tell. If we don't know that you're a Christian, we're not going to bother you, and we're not going to make any effort to find out if you're a Christian. But if we do find out, then you're going to go through some amount of persecution. Steve?
I was just wondering, was Jesus 33 when he was crucified then?
Somewhere around there. Jesus was born somewhere between 0 AD to 4 AD, probably closer to 4. So he was right around 30 to 33.
What defines AD then?
I'm sorry?
What defines AD?
The birth of Jesus Christ.
The birth?
Yes. So time.
That's what I thought.
Yes. The time is divided between BC, before Christ, and AD, which confusingly is Latin. It means Anno Domino, which is forgetting exactly how that translates. But Anno would be annual, so year or time. And I think it's time after our Lord. That's the Domino part. So what happened was there was a monk in the Middle Ages, whose name I forget, who calculated this out. He figured out from the time where he was writing, and he worked his way backwards to the point that he thought Jesus was born. And he set that as the year 0. And so from that point forward, we go up. So year 1 and all the way up to 2014. This way we go backwards, which is why we have the Abraham, I'm forgetting exactly what the time period he was around. But anyway, you have a date, and it will say something like it started in 4004 BC, and then it ended in 3800, something like that. That's why we do it that way, because we're moving backwards from the birth of Christ. Now, actually, since that monk figured this out, other people have come along and checked his figures, and the consensus is that he missed it by about 4 years. So Jesus was probably not actually born in 0 AD. He was probably born in 4 AD. So technically he was born 4 years after the birth of Christ. Yeah, Ryan.
No, I was going to mention what you already said, which was that most people that study what the monk did came to a consensus that he was about 4 or 5 years off with his calculation, and therefore our calendar is 4 or 5 years off. So when people start saying the world's going to end in 2012, well,
right.
We're not in 2012, or weren't in 2012
Yeah.
when these predictions are supposed to be coming true. Then the point to what Steve said earlier about isn't the Bible inspired by God? I think one of the points he's making is that why would we question Peter's ability to write when it's God that's telling him what to write? Mm-hmm. So he would be able to, because the Bible says they were unlearned men. Mm-hmm. So we know that they didn't have formal education like Paul, who describes himself as a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He has formal education,
right.
But that if it's being inspired by God, then that certainly would be possible. That he would have the skill set, whatever he needed to write it. And we know that in Matthew chapter 10, that specifically God gave them power even before he passed away. Then we know they received even more of the gift of the Holy Spirit with the ability to speak in tongues. So it always amuses me when I watch these documentaries or studies of the Bible when people talk about apostles or the Bible itself as if it's not inspired by God. Or they say something ridiculous like they reduce Jesus to the form of an average human being. One of my favorite is when they say he's delirious because he didn't know who his brothers and sisters were. Mm-hmm. Because they say your brothers and sisters are outside. He says, who is my brothers and sisters? And he wasn't delirious. He was making a point that if you follow me, I consider you part of my family.
Right.
So sometimes people just go so analytical and strict on, and they don't treat the Bible as what 2 Timothy chapter 3:16 says, that all scripture is given by inspiration of God.
Right. But we need to spend a little bit of time, not a lot of time, talking about some of these skeptics, so that if you are ever in a discussion with somebody about 1 Peter, and they say, I've been looking into this, and there's all these scholars that have these doubts about it, it doesn't come as a surprise to you. Oh, wow, somebody's got doubts about it? We need to be aware that there are doubts about it. We also need to be aware of why we can look at those and say, well, we don't necessarily need to take those too seriously. The counter-argument to what Brian just said about Peter being inspired, so obviously it was written by Peter, is that the alternative is that it was written by, obviously, a Christian who attributed it to Peter the Apostle. The idea being that, if I was to write a letter, well, who's Anthony? Nobody's going to bother listening to Anthony, but if I say it comes from Peter, then you might listen to it. That's the idea, that it was written by some other guy who then attributed it to Peter. And of course, then you would ask, well, isn't he lying? And then that would not be something that
Yeah,
he
to
would
what
want.
purpose?
That he wouldn't, we wouldn't want to be reading something that was written by somebody that lied about who he was. And the argument there is, well, it wasn't such a big deal back then. It wasn't written as to be false. It was just to sort of get more authority. The problem with that argument is that we do know of a couple of letters that claim to be written by Paul. We have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there's a 3rd Corinthians out there also that claims to be written by Paul. And the church did accept that letter for a while, for like 100 years or so. But then it became apparent that it wasn't written by Paul, that it was forgery. And they rejected that letter. They stopped using that letter. They stopped accepting it. So the church actually has a history of accepting letters written by who it said they were, then discovering that it was not written by that guy and rejecting it. So, we covered some of these academic questions about Peter, but in addition to that, from a very early time in the church's history, so the first 100 years, first 200 years, what we see is a lot of educated Christians, looking at Peter, accepting it as written by Peter. Not a lot of questions from those early Christians about Peter. And it's not that they were just blindly taking it. In 2 Peter, there is a question from those educated Christians about whether it was written by this guy, Peter the Apostle. Not so much here. So I'm going to take it that Peter really did write this book.
But then also, we have the benefit of that exhaustive study that you did on the Bible. So people sitting here, have that benefit of you going, into history and researching where this book came from.
Right, absolutely. Okay, turn into the back of your Bible where you've got your maps, and take a look at one of the maps that shows you Paul's journeys, which shows you a good deal of the Roman Empire. And if you look at those maps, you will see up in the kind of in the upper right corner, the area that we today call Asia Minor, which is also known as the country of Turkey. Most of Turkey is in Asia Minor. And it is basically a huge peninsula. Up on the north, you've got the Black Sea. Down the south, you've got the Mediterranean. And then over to the west, you have the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. Back in Roman times, there were 7 provinces, I think, in that area. And in verse 1, Peter tells us who he's writing to. He says he's writing to, he's writing to Pontus and Cappadocia, Galatia, Asia, and Bithynia. Which, if you look at your maps, you'll find all of them on that map. Also notice as you're looking at your map, so Asia is right there on the western edge, goes all the way to the coast. As you can move eastward, so to the right. From there, you've got Bithynia up to the north of Asia. It's on the coast of the Black Sea. Then you've got Galatia, kind of right in the middle. And then to the north of that, you've got Pontus, and then over again farther to the east, you've got Cappadocia. You'll notice that except for Asia, none of those provinces are on the coast, which doesn't seem all important to us. But back then, they didn't have good roads for the most part. The Romans had made quite a bit of advances there, but still, going by road takes a really long time because you're limited to the speed that a horse can pull a wagon. To us, we've got trucks that are running down the road at 70, 80 miles an hour. You're going 2 or 3 miles an hour. It takes a really long time to go by road anywhere. Which means if you want to be a city of any size, you need to be on the coast. Because on the coast, you can have a port, and you can have ships going back and forth, powered by the wind. And so ships are, and transport by water, much better, much easier, and you can carry a lot more than you can by road. Which means that these provinces that we're just looking at, they're back away from the coast. Now, I know that they border the Black Sea, but that area was not well settled at this time. So, in other words, as you look at these provinces, and a province is roughly equivalent to a U.S. state. It's an area of 129,000 miles. California, by contrast, is 159,000 miles. So a little bit smaller than California. There's a mountain range, which you may not see in your map, but there is a mountain range between these provinces and the other ones that are on the coast. There's also a big salt lake and a desert. So you've got a big salt lake. Of course, nobody's going to bother going to a salt lake because you can't drink it. You got a desert, and you got a mountain range between these people and the ones on the coast. Which, all of that together means Pontus has 4 cities of any size. So villages, tiny little villages, and then anything bigger than that, a city, you have 4 of them. Just 4.
Is that correct? 129,000? I mean, it's 1,000 miles from Michigan to Florida.
That's what I was told, yes.
And I'm looking at the scale of my Bible. It has it as 200 miles. It would be 200 from one of this, like from Pontus to Cappadocia.
Remember that square miles is...
Oh yeah, you just say square. Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Not the distance across, but all of it together. So Pontus has just 4 cities. Bithynia, right down here, it's only got 12 cities of any size. Period. Cappadocia, this place right here, just like Pontus and Bithynia, very sparsely settled. In fact, a little bit later on in church history, when monasteries start getting founded, the idea of a monastery is that you want to separate yourself from the world. You want to be alone, essentially, so that you can worship God, so that you can pay attention to God and not be distracted by the rest of the world. So you're not going to put a monastery down in the middle of Rome. Or in our case, you're not going to put a monastery in the middle of New York City. You're going to find some really remote place where there's not very many people, and a lot of them got founded in Cappadocia. So very few people. Only 2 cities in Cappadocia. So we got 4 up here in Pontus, we got 12 in Bithynia. Those are booming places compared to Cappadocia, which has just 2. So, in short, what we have here is a very large area. And again, remember, California is a pretty big area, but you can drive across that in a day or so. But remember, we're dealing at the rate of a horse can walk. So it takes a long time to travel around. And it's expensive, and it's difficult, so people don't do it very much.
Do they speak the same language?
Excellent question. Do they speak the same language? Because this area is so large, and it is so remote from the seacoast, what we have in this area is a collection of people. We have the native people who speak the native language, whatever that might be, and there would be a different one for each of these regions. We have some Greek settlers who in the last 500-600 years have migrated from Greece, from those coastal cities eastward. So we have some Greeks, and we also have some Roman colonists. What the Romans would do, what the Roman state would do, is they would have soldiers who I think they were required to serve for 25 years. After they were done with their 25 years, when they retired, the state would give them a certain amount of money, and it would give that veteran some land to farm. And typically what they would do is they would establish a colony, a city somewhere, that they would give to these Roman soldiers who were retired now. And so they would found a city in this place, and they would develop it. And the idea is, one, you've got a Roman city that's going to help spread some Roman culture. We've got a city made up of veterans, so these guys are going to be able to fight if some invader comes in. So in these regions, the Romans have been establishing some colonies. So we've got some native people, we've got some Greek people, and we've got some Romans. But one of the things that's just hard for us to grasp because it's so different from us. Again, travel is so slow. That means that if you live in a city on the coast, you got sailors coming in from ships all over the world. And so you're going to hear about some different ideas. You're going to hear, there's going to be a lot of mixing. But when you get away from the coast, when you get away from the big rivers, that doesn't happen. Ideas spread much, much, much more slowly. And languages spread much, much more slowly. And so what we don't have in these regions that Peter is writing to, we don't have a single people. We don't have a people. You know how Americans, we've got people who have come from all over the world and they've all settled here. Well, eventually, by the second generation, typically they've learned English and they have become Americans. They're not Greeks or English or Welsh or whatever, or Polish anymore. They are Americans. It's called integration. These people haven't done that. What we have is some native people who are still speaking the native language. We have some Greek people who are mostly off by themselves as the Greek people, and we have some Roman people who are off by themselves as the Roman people. So this is not an area that has mixed to any degree. It's very very scattered. It also means you've got lots of different religions, lots of languages. They don't have a common culture. So this is different than most of the rest of the Roman Empire, most of the rest of the area where our New Testament was written to. But on the other hand, all of that said, contrary to what you might think, this region produced a lot of great Christians. In the next century, so Peter, we said, was written somewhere before 64 AD. In the next century, so from 100 to 200, a number of great bishops, great Christian thinkers came from these regions. They produced many of, Brian talked about the study that we just did of the canon of the Bible a couple months ago. Some of the guys that we referenced that had left writings behind about the state of the church in their time that we looked at come from these cities, quite possibly because of the letter that Peter wrote to them. So, contrary to what you might think, a lot of famous Christians came from this area. So it developed a lot of very strong Christian faith.
You said bishops, is that Catholic?
Yes and no. When we talk about ancient Christianity, so first couple hundred years before Constantine made Christianity legal, we do talk about bishops, but we shouldn't think of those bishops in the same way that today we think of somebody like the Bishop of Lansing. Even though that idea did, over 2,000 years, develop from the bishops of that time. What I think happened, what appears to me to happen, is that in the first century, so this period that we're talking about here, you had small churches that had an eldership, just exactly like what we think about. We got 2 or 3 guys appointed as elders, and they are the ones that run the church. In the next couple centuries, I think what happened is that you got a group of guys, a group of men. And in any group of men, one of those guys is going to be the most dominant, either by force of personality, by education, by just general spiritual learning, just the respect that everybody else has for him. And that person came to have a leading role among the elders. And that person came to be called the bishop, distinct from the rest of the elders. So it's not so much that everybody decided, hey, we need to have a bishop who's in charge of the church. It's something that developed over time. And nobody, interestingly enough, nobody had a problem with that back then. Nobody, there's no controversy, any of the Christian writings that I've read about that happening. It just naturally sort of happened. So, in other words, back to your question, Steve, are these Catholic bishops? Not in the sense that we think of Catholic bishops. There does seem to be basically a chief elder in these churches, in many of the churches. I shouldn't say all, in many of the churches. But there's not a whole lot in common between those guys and what we think of as a Catholic bishop today.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. There's the next question I want to ask is, who is it written to? Basically, we've got two choices. It could be written to Gentiles or Jews. Jews, of course, are the descendants of Abraham. Gentiles is everybody else. So we've got Jews or Gentiles.
Can't you have Christian and Jews?
Absolutely. So we've got these two groups of people, and yes, some Jews became Christians, and some Gentiles became Christians. There's a lot of difference between these two groups of people. They come from very different backgrounds, very different concepts of God. We don't really have a good parallel to that. Trying to think of some comparison, but I can't think of anything that really is like that in our culture.
How about a Muslim converting to Christianity?
That's a possibility, sure. Not a lot of those, so it's hard to say what culturally that would be like. But yeah, very different groups of people, which is why we ask this question. Because, for example, Romans. Well, no, that's not a good example, because actually Romans is mostly written to Jewish Christians. Most of the New Testament is written to Jews who became Christians. But Corinthians is a good example. There you have a church where there are some Jewish Christians, but there's also a lot of Gentiles who became Christians. And they're trying to mix together, and they're not having much success. Because they come from such vastly different backgrounds. So, if you're a Jew, you come into church thinking we're going to do it this way. But if you're a Gentile, you come into church thinking we're going to do it a different way. And they have to work out these differences. Most of the people back then, in other words, in that first 100, 200 years, looked at Peter and decided that it was probably written to Jewish converts, Jews who became Christians. Steve?
What language did Peter write it in?
Greek.
Greek?
Yep. The entire New Testament is written in Greek. Most of the ancient commentators think that it was written to Jewish Christians. Oddly enough, most of the modern ones think that it was written to Gentile Christians. There's not a lot of indication out of the book itself, but there are some that can lead it in both directions. And I'm not going to take a stand on either one, simply because he doesn't really tell us whether he's writing to Jews who became Christians or Gentiles who became Christians. What he is writing to are people who can look back on their previous beliefs, whatever that might have been, and Peter tells them, and they can conclude, what I believed before wasn't enough. And that would be true whether you were a Jew or a Gentile. Both of them, Peter says, regardless, need to accept that what you did before was empty, meaningless, not good enough, sinful even, and that you need to become Christian, not Jewish, not Gentile. but Christian. Okay. Last thing I want to point out tonight, this morning, is just that Peter doesn't seem to know these guys directly. He seems to be writing to people that he's heard about. Maybe he knows some of the Christians that went out to convert in those areas, but he doesn't actually seem to know these people personally, the way Paul knows the Corinthians, for instance. The question of who converted these Christians is an interesting one. Most of the regions of the ancient world have a tradition that one of the apostles came here and converted the first Christians. Each one of the 12 apostles has a traditional area of the world that they're supposed to have worked in. We don't know who worked in this area. There's no apostle that's associated with this area. So we don't know who converted these Christians. It might have been, one theory that I was reading is that those Roman colonists that I was talking about, some of those guys became Christians. They may have brought Christianity. Some of those Greek settlers may have brought Christianity. It may have just slowly spread as people do travel from the coast inland sometimes. It may have slowly spread that way. We don't know how Christianity got there. We do know that it was there pretty early, since we decided that 1 Peter was written pretty early. Remember we said that James was written somewhere around 40 AD, and Peter was written probably after that, but before 64, when Peter was crucified. So there's only about, at most, 20 years, and probably less, between the writing of James and the writing of Peter. Both written pretty early, both written early in the development of the church. And what Peter, in both cases, what James and Peter want these Christians to understand is, how do you act like a Christian? How do you behave the way that Christ wants you to behave? Especially since, in both James and Peter, these Christians are going through some sort of suffering, some sort of trial, because they're a Christian. And Peter wants them to know, he tells us in the very last verse, stand firm in the true grace of Christ, of God. And so that's what we're going to talk about, how to stand firm in the grace of God. Any concluding remarks or questions about 1 Peter? Yes, sir.
So back to Steve's point about question about bishop. The Catholic Church likes to say that Peter was the first pope, and it's based on the scripture where Jesus says, "Upon this rock I'm going to build this church," but the literal translation of those words, rock, one is big rock, one is small rock.
Yep.
And Peter is the small rock.
Yep.
So that is inaccurate to say that he was the first pope. The term didn't even exist at that time, but that's just a fun fact to toss out there.
There's a strong tradition that the church in Rome, there are two strong traditions. One that it was founded by Paul, one that it was founded by Peter. And from what I understand, there's no real way to say which one is right. The Catholic Church would argue it was founded by Peter. There's no particular reason to think that it had to be Peter or that it had to be Paul. It could have been founded even by somebody else. The bottom line is we don't know who started the church in Rome. Peter does seem to have been associated with it for a significant amount of time, which is why they claim that he was the first bishop of the church in Rome. It's possible. Unfortunately, it was so long ago that there's a lot of stuff that is just not known anymore. So we will get into the actual teachings of 1 Peter next week, and hopefully learn some good stuff about how to be Christians.